The desert sun was merciless that morning, beating down on the convoy of military vehicles as they moved through the rocky terrain of Afghanistan. Captain Sarah Martinez sat in the lead vehicle, her eyes scanning the horizon for any signs of danger. At 28, she was one of the youngest female officers to command a forward operating base, and she knew that every decision she made could mean the difference between life and death for her soldiers. The intelligence reports had been clear: a routine supply run to deliver medical supplies and ammunition to an outpost 20 miles away. What the reports hadn't mentioned was that insurgent forces had been tracking their movements for weeks, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. Sarah's radio crackled to life. "Captain, this is Sergeant Johnson. We've got movement on the ridge to our east. Could be nothing, but something doesn't feel right." She lifted her binoculars and peered toward the rocky outcropping. The landscape appeared empty, but Sarah had learned to trust her instincts during her 3 deployments. Something was definitely wrong. The usual sounds of the desert, the wind whistling through the rocks, the distant calls of birds, were absent. It was too quiet. "All units, this is Alpha 1. Sarah spoke into her radio. "Reduce speed and maintain spacing. Keep your eyes open." The convoy consisted of 5 armored vehicles carrying essential supplies and a medical team. Among the 30 soldiers under her command were some of the finest men and women she'd ever served with. There was Corporal Lisa Chen, a medic who had saved countless lives; Staff Sergeant Mike Rodriguez, an explosives expert who could defuse a bomb while under fire; and Private First Class David Thompson, barely 19 but already proving himself as a skilled marksman. As they rounded a bend in the dirt road, the world exploded into chaos. The first rocket-propelled grenade hit the second vehicle in the convoy, sending it careening off the road in a ball of flames and smoke. The sound was deafening, a thunderous crash followed by the screaming of twisted metal and human voices. "Contact! Contact!" someone yelled over the radio. Sarah's training kicked in immediately. "All units, defensive positions. Return fire!" Gunfire erupted from the rocks on both sides of the road. The insurgents had planned this ambush perfectly, positioning themselves on the high ground with clear lines of sight down into the valley where the convoy was trapped. "Ben, get to that vehicle!" Sarah shouted, pointing toward the smoking wreckage. "Rodriguez, set up suppressing fire on that ridge." The battle was intense and chaotic. Bullets whizzed past Sarah's head as she coordinated her soldiers' response. She could see muzzle flashes from at least a dozen different positions among the rocks. The insurgents had superior numbers and positioning, but her soldiers were better trained and equipped. For 20 minutes, the firefight raged. Sarah moved between positions, directing fire and ensuring her wounded soldiers received medical attention. 2 soldiers had been killed in the initial blast, and several others were injured. Then disaster struck. As Sarah was moving to check on a wounded soldier, a sniper's bullet caught her in the shoulder, spinning her around and sending her crashing to the ground behind a large boulder. The pain was immediate and intense, like being hit with a sledgehammer made of fire. "Captain's down! Captain's down!" she heard someone yell. Blood was flowing freely from the wound, soaking through her uniform. She tried to stand, but a second bullet caught her in the leg, sending her sprawling face first into the sand. The gritty desert sand mixed with her blood, creating a muddy paste that clung to her skin and filled her mouth. "Stay down, Captain!" Sergeant Johnson's voice seemed to come from very far away, though he was only a few feet behind the next boulder. Sarah's vision began to blur as shock and blood loss took their toll. She could hear the battle continuing around her, but it seemed distant and unreal. Her soldiers were fighting bravely, but without clear leadership, she knew they were in serious trouble. She tried to speak into her radio, but only a weak whisper came out. "This is Alpha 1, need medevac." The radio fell from her trembling fingers into the blood-soaked sand. As consciousness began to fade, Sarah could hear the insurgent forces growing bolder, their gunfire moving closer to her position. She realized with growing horror that her soldiers might have to retreat and leave her behind. In this part of Afghanistan, being captured alive was often worse than dying in battle. The last thing she remembered before darkness claimed her was the sound of helicopters in the distance. Whether they were friend or foe, she couldn't tell. When Sarah next opened her eyes, the sun had moved significantly across the sky. The sounds of battle had faded to sporadic gunfire in the distance. She was still lying in the sand where she had fallen, her blood having pooled around her, and begun to coagulate in the heat. Her mouth was full of sand and blood. Every breath sent shooting pains through her chest. She could barely feel her legs, and her left arm hung useless at her side. For a moment, she wondered if she was dying. Then she heard voices. American voices calling out coordinates and casualty reports. Her soldiers were still fighting. They hadn't abandoned the position. With tremendous effort, Sarah managed to roll over and look around. The convoy's defensive perimeter had held, but barely. She could see 3 of her vehicles still operational, with her soldiers using them as cover. The insurgent attack had been repelled, but at a heavy cost. Corporal Chen appeared at her side, sliding into cover behind the boulder. "Captain, thank God you're alive. We've been holding position, but we need orders. The enemy has pulled back, but they're regrouping about half a mile to the east." Sarah tried to sit up, but the pain was overwhelming. How many? Casualties? 4 KIA, 7 wounded. But we're still combat effective. The question is, do we continue to the outpost or fall back to base? Sarah's mind was clearer now. Despite the pain and blood loss, she knew that falling back would mean abandoning the critical supplies the outpost desperately needed. But continuing forward with wounded soldiers and damaged vehicles would be extremely dangerous. "Help me up," she whispered. "Ma'am, you need a medic. You've lost a lot of blood." "Help me up, Corporal. That's an order." Chen reluctantly helped Sarah lean against the boulder. The world spun around her, but she forced herself to focus. Her soldiers needed leadership, and she was still their commander. "Get Rodriguez over here," she managed to say. "And Johnson, we need to reassess our situation." As her senior non-commissioned officers gathered around her position, Sarah began to formulate a plan. She was wounded, bleeding, and barely conscious, but she was not defeated. Her soldiers were looking to her for guidance, and she would not let them down. The insurgents had made a critical mistake. They had assumed that wounding her would break her unit's will to fight. Instead, it had only made her more determined to complete the mission and get her soldiers home safely. Little did anyone know that this moment, bleeding in the desert sand while under enemy fire, would become the defining moment of Sarah's military career and would ultimately lead to changes in how the entire base operated. But first, she had to survive the next few hours and find a way to turn what appeared to be a disastrous ambush into a tactical victory that would save lives and complete their vital mission. Sarah's hands shook as she gripped her radio, blood still seeping from her wounds into the desert sand. Sergeant Johnson and Staff Sergeant Rodriguez crouched beside her, their faces grim as they waited for orders. The sporadic gunfire in the distance reminded everyone that the enemy hadn't given up. They were simply regrouping for another attack. "Status report," Sarah said, her voice barely above a whisper but carrying the unmistakable tone of command that her soldiers had learned to respect. Rodriguez spoke first. "We've got 1 vehicle completely destroyed, another with engine damage but still mobile. The remaining 3 are operational. We're down to about 70% of our ammunition, and the medical supplies we were transporting are intact." Johnson added, "The wounded are stable for now, but Corporal Matthews needs surgery within 6 hours or we're going to lose him. And ma'am, with respect, you need immediate medical attention too." Sarah closed her eyes for a moment, feeling the weight of command pressing down on her, like the desert heat. Every decision she made now would affect the lives of her soldiers and the success of their mission. The outpost they were supposed to resupply was still 12 miles away, and intelligence reports indicated it was running critically low on medical supplies and ammunition. "What's our communication status with base?" she asked. "Intermittent," Johnson replied. "The radio took some damage in the initial attack. We can get through occasionally, but not reliably." Sarah knew that calling for immediate evacuation was an option, but it would mean abandoning their mission. The soldiers at the outpost were counting on these supplies. More importantly, retreating now would signal to the insurgents that a successful ambush could derail any future supply runs, potentially cutting off other forward positions. "Ma'am," Rodriguez said quietly, "maybe we should consider—" "No," Sarah interrupted, reading his thoughts. We don't abandon the mission. These supplies are critical, and if we turn back now, we're telling the enemy that they can stop us anytime they want to set up an ambush. She struggled to sit up straighter, ignoring the fresh wave of pain that shot through her body. Here's what we're going to do. Rodriguez, take 2 vehicles and half our remaining ammunition. You're going to create a diversion about 2 miles north of here. Make some noise, fire off some rounds, make them think we're trying to flank them from that direction. Rodriguez frowned. That's going to split our forces, Captain. We'll be vulnerable if they attack the main group. That's exactly what I'm counting on, Sarah said, her strategic mind working despite her injuries. They're expecting us to either retreat or try to fight through their main position. They won't expect us to split up and use unconventional tactics. She turned to Johnson. While Rodriguez is drawing their attention north, you're going to take the remaining vehicles and push hard toward the outpost. Use the damaged vehicle as a decoy, rig it with explosives, and send it toward their position while you take the supply vehicles around the southern route. Johnson looked skeptical. Ma'am, that southern route goes through some rough terrain. If we get stuck out there. We won't get stuck, Sarah said firmly. Chen surveyed that route last month. It's passable if you go slow and careful. The insurgents won't expect us to risk our vehicles in that terrain, which is exactly why it will work. Corporal Chen, who had been quietly monitoring the radio, suddenly looked up. Captain, I'm getting something from base. Sounds like they're trying to reach us. Sarah took the radio handset, pressing it close to her ear. Through the static, she could make out the voice of Colonel Harrison, the base commander. Alpha 1, this is home base. What's your status? We've lost contact for over an hour. Home base, this is Alpha 1, Sarah responded, her voice stronger now that she had a plan. We've encountered heavy resistance. 4 KIA, multiple wounded, but mission is still viable. Request you stand by for further updates. There was a long pause before the colonel's voice came back. Alpha 1, intelligence suggests enemy forces in your area number at least 40 combatants. Recommend you abort mission and return to base immediately. Sarah looked at her assembled soldiers. She could see the doubt in some of their eyes, but also the determination that had carried them through countless missions together. They trusted her judgment, even when it seemed impossible. Negative. Home base. We are continuing to objective. The outpost needs these supplies, and we're going to deliver them. Another pause. Alpha 1, you are not to risk your soldiers unnecessarily. That's a direct order. Sarah closed her eyes, knowing she was about to disobey a direct order from her commanding officer. Home base, I understand your concerns, but I have a tactical plan that will minimize risk while ensuring mission success. Request permission to proceed. Permission denied, Captain. Return to base immediately. Sarah handed the radio back to Chen and looked at her soldiers. This was the moment that would define not just this mission, but potentially her entire career. She could follow orders, retreat to safety, and face the knowledge that the soldiers at the outpost might die because they didn't receive the medical supplies she was carrying. Or she could trust her judgment, disobey orders, and risk everything on a plan that might save lives. Ma'am? Johnson asked quietly. Your orders? Sarah made her decision. Chen, tell base that we're experiencing communication difficulties and cannot receive clear transmissions. Johnson, Rodriguez, we proceed as planned. We're going to complete this mission. The next hour was a whirlwind of preparation and movement. Despite her wounds, Sarah insisted on remaining with the main convoy, coordinating the complex maneuver she had planned. She knew that if anything went wrong, she would be held personally responsible for every casualty. Rodriguez's diversion team moved north, setting up positions and creating enough noise and movement to convince the insurgents that the main American force was attempting to outflank them. Meanwhile, Johnson prepared the supply convoy for the dangerous journey through the southern terrain. As they loaded the wounded soldiers into the vehicles, Corporal Matthews regained consciousness briefly. Captain, he whispered, don't risk everyone for me. Just get the supplies through. Sarah gripped his hand. We're not leaving anyone behind, Corporal, and we're not failing this mission. The damaged vehicle, now rigged with explosives and set on a timer, would be sent toward the enemy position as a decoy while the real convoy slipped away to the south. It was a dangerous gamble. If the insurgents realized what was happening too quickly, they could redirect their forces and trap the convoy in the difficult terrain where the vehicles would be sitting ducks. As the convoy prepared to move out, Sarah felt a moment of doubt. She was gambling with the lives of her soldiers, based on her own judgment against direct orders from her superior officer. If she was wrong, if the plan failed, she would be responsible for potentially devastating casualties. But as she looked at the faces of her soldiers, tired, scared, but still trusting in her leadership, she knew she had made the right choice. These men and women had followed her through 3 deployments, and they deserved a leader who would take calculated risks to save lives and complete critical missions. "All right, people," Sarah said into her radio, her voice carrying the authority that had earned her the respect of every soldier under her command. "We're going to show these insurgents what happens when they mess with the United States Army. Let's move out." The convoy lurched into motion, heading toward terrain that no military manual would recommend for armored vehicles, while behind them the decoy vehicle continued on its predetermined course toward the enemy position. Sarah gripped the side of her vehicle as pain washed over her again, but her mind was focused on the tactical situation. In the next few hours, her unconventional plan would either prove to be a stroke of military genius or a career-ending disaster that cost the lives of soldiers who trusted her judgment. Either way, there was no turning back now. The convoy moved slowly through the rocky southern terrain, each vehicle carefully navigating between boulders and deep crevices that could trap or damage their heavy armored trucks. Sarah gritted her teeth against the pain as every bump and jolt sent fresh agony through her wounded shoulder and leg. She maintained radio contact with both Rodriguez's diversion team and Johnson, who was leading the supply vehicles through the treacherous path. "Alpha 2, this is Alpha 1, she called to Rodriguez. "What's your status?" "We've got their attention, Captain." Rodriguez's voice crackled through the static. "They're moving at least 20 combatants toward our position. Looks like they're buying the diversion." Sarah allowed herself a small smile despite the pain. The first part of her plan was working. The insurgents were focusing their attention on the noise and movement to the north, believing that the main American force was attempting to outflank them from that direction. "Maintain position for another 15 minutes. Then begin your withdrawal," Sarah ordered. "Don't let them pin you down." "Roger that, Alpha 1. We'll keep them busy." The supply convoy continued its slow progress through the difficult terrain. Sarah could see the strain on Johnson's face as he concentrated on navigating his vehicle around a particularly large boulder. Behind them, Corporal Matthews was being kept stable by Chen, but his condition was deteriorating. Time was running out for the wounded soldier. Suddenly, a massive explosion echoed across the desert from the north. The decoy vehicle had reached its target and detonated, creating a spectacular fireball that would convince the insurgents that they had scored a major victory against the American convoy. "Beautiful," Johnson muttered over the radio. "They'll think they got our supply truck." Sarah's radio crackled with urgent transmissions from Rodriguez's team. "Alpha 1, the explosion has them really stirred up. They're celebrating and moving more forces toward the blast site. Now would be a good time to punch through." "Copy that, Alpha 2. Begin your withdrawal as planned. Meet us at Rally Point Bravo." The next 30 minutes were the longest of Sarah's military career. The convoy pushed through increasingly difficult terrain, with several vehicles having to be winched over rocky obstacles. At one point, the second supply truck became stuck in a deep sandy wash, and precious minutes were lost digging it out. Sarah's vision kept blurring from blood loss, but she forced herself to stay alert and maintain command of the operation. She knew that if she passed out now, her soldiers might lose confidence in the plan and abort the mission. "How much farther to the outpost?" she asked Chen, who was monitoring their GPS position. "About 4 miles. But we should be hitting easier terrain in another mile or so." As if her words were prophetic, the convoy crested a rocky ridge and found themselves looking down into a valley with much smoother terrain. In the distance, Sarah could see the outpost they had been trying to reach, a small collection of concrete buildings and defensive walls, surrounded by observation towers. "Alpha Base, this is Alpha 1, Sarah called on the radio, switching to the outpost's frequency. "We are approximately 4 miles from your position with supplies. What's your status?" The response came immediately, filled with relief and surprise. "Alpha 1, this is Alpha Base. We've been monitoring radio traffic about an attack on your convoy. We thought you had been destroyed. Our medical situation is critical. We've had casualties from mortar attacks over the past 2 days. We're coming in hot, Alpha Base. Have your medical team ready to receive wounded, and prepare to offload supplies quickly. We may have hostile forces pursuing. As the convoy descended into the valley, Sarah felt a surge of satisfaction. Her gamble was paying off. They had successfully avoided the main insurgent force and were about to complete their mission. But her satisfaction was short-lived. Rodriguez's voice came over the radio with urgent news. Alpha 1, we've got a problem. The insurgents figured out our diversion faster than expected. We've got at least 15 vehicles heading toward the outpost from the northeast. They're about 20 minutes behind us. Sarah's heart sank. The insurgents had realized they had been tricked and were now racing to intercept the supply convoy before it could reach the safety of the outpost. Alpha 2, what's your status? We're clear of the immediate area, but we can't intercept them before they reach you. You're on your own for the next 20 minutes. Sarah looked at the outpost, still 3 miles away. At their current speed through the valley terrain, they might just make it before the insurgents arrived. But it would be close. Johnson, push the vehicles harder. We need to reach that outpost before the cavalry arrives. Roger, Captain. All vehicles increase speed. Emergency protocols in effect. The convoy raced across the valley floor, kicking up clouds of dust that would be visible for miles. Sarah knew they were sacrificing stealth for speed, but they had no choice. It was now a race against time. As they approached the outpost, Sarah could see soldiers manning the defensive positions and preparing to provide covering fire if needed. The outpost commander had clearly received their radio transmissions and was ready for their arrival. Alpha 1, this is Alpha Base. We have eyes on hostile vehicles approximately 10 miles to the northeast and closing fast. Estimate 15 to 20 minutes before they arrive. Sarah's convoy was still 2 miles from the outpost when she spotted dust clouds on the horizon behind them. The insurgents were closer than expected, and their vehicles were faster on the open terrain. Chen, get on the radio to base. Tell them we need immediate air support at these coordinates. We're about to be caught in the open. Already tried, Captain. No air assets available for at least 30 minutes. Sarah realized that her soldiers were about to face another firefight, this time while protecting critical supplies and wounded personnel in the open desert. But they were so close to completing the mission that she refused to consider failure. All vehicles prepare for contact. We're going to make it to that outpost, and we're going to deliver these supplies. The race across the final 2 miles was intense. Sarah could see the insurgent vehicles gaining ground behind them, while ahead, the outpost grew larger and more detailed. She could make out individual soldiers on the walls and see the medical team waiting near the main gate. With 1 mile to go, the first shots rang out from behind them. The insurgent vehicles had gotten close enough to open fire with small arms, though at that range most shots went wide. Incoming fire! Johnson yelled over the radio. All units, evasive maneuvers! The convoy began zigzagging across the desert floor, making themselves harder targets while still pushing toward the outpost. Sarah could hear bullets pinging off the armor of her vehicle, and she ducked instinctively as a round shattered the rear window. 500 yards! Chen called out, excitement clear in her voice. The outpost's defensive guns opened up, sending streams of machine gun fire over the convoy toward the pursuing insurgent vehicles. Several of the enemy trucks swerved and fell back, but others continued their pursuit. Alpha 1, this is Alpha Base. You are cleared for immediate entry. Medical team standing by. Sarah's convoy raced through the outpost gates just as Rodriguez's diversion team arrived from another direction, having successfully withdrawn from their decoy mission. The heavy gates slammed shut behind them as insurgent bullets struck the reinforced walls. As her vehicle came to a stop in the compound, Sarah finally allowed herself to collapse against her seat. They had made it. Despite being wounded, despite disobeying orders, despite facing overwhelming odds, they had successfully delivered the critical supplies to the outpost. Medical personnel immediately swarmed the vehicles, pulling out the wounded soldiers and rushing them toward the medical facility. Corporal Matthews was quickly loaded onto a stretcher and wheeled away, still alive thanks to the speed of their unconventional route. But even as Sarah felt relief at completing the mission, she knew that her real challenges were just beginning. She had disobeyed direct orders from her commanding officer, and there would be consequences when she returned to base. What she didn't know yet was that her actions during this mission would ultimately transform how the entire base approached leadership, tactical thinking, and mission planning. The wounded captain who had bled in the desert sand was about to teach her superiors some important lessons about command. 3 days after the successful supply run, Sarah found herself sitting in a sterile medical facility. Her wounds properly treated, but her future uncertain. The doctors had removed the bullets and stopped the bleeding, but the larger question of what would happen to her career remained unanswered. The door to her room opened, and Colonel Harrison entered, his expression unreadable. Behind him was General Patricia Williams, the regional commander, whose presence immediately told Sarah that this was not going to be a routine debriefing. "Captain Martinez," the colonel began, his voice formal and cold, "you disobeyed a direct order to return to base. Your actions put your soldiers at unnecessary risk and violated established chain of command protocols." Ow! Sarah sat up straighter in her hospital bed, ignoring the pain in her shoulder. "I take full responsibility for my decisions." General Williams stepped forward, studying Sarah with sharp, intelligent eyes. "Captain, your mission was successful. The supplies were delivered, and most importantly, no additional soldiers were lost after the initial ambush. However, success doesn't automatically justify insubordination. I understand, ma'am. I made a calculated decision based on my assessment of the tactical situation and the critical needs of the outpost." Colonel Harrison frowned. "A calculated decision? You were wounded, possibly suffering from shock and blood loss. How can you be certain your judgment wasn't compromised?" Sarah had been expecting this question. "Sir, I maintained clear communication with my senior NCOs throughout the operation. My tactical plan was reviewed and understood by my team leaders. If they had felt my judgment was compromised, they would have intervened." "And what if your plan had failed?" the general asked. "What if you had lost more soldiers pursuing an unnecessary risk?" "With respect, ma'am, the risk was not unnecessary. The outpost was critically low on medical supplies. Intelligence reports indicated that enemy forces were planning to increase attacks on isolated positions. If we had failed to resupply them, soldiers would have died." The room fell silent for several long moments. Sarah could hear the distant sounds of the medical facility, nurses moving through hallways, the beeping of monitoring equipment, helicopter rotors from ongoing operations. General Williams pulled up a chair and sat down, her posture becoming less formal. "Captain, I've spent the last 3 days reviewing your service record and interviewing your soldiers. What I found was interesting." Sarah remained quiet, waiting for the general to continue. "Your soldiers don't just respect you, they trust you completely. Sergeant Rodriguez told me that when you were bleeding in the sand, giving orders while barely conscious, his first thought wasn't doubt about your plan. It was determination to make sure your plan succeeded." The general opened a folder she had been carrying. "Corporal Chen said something particularly striking. She said that watching you maintain command while wounded taught her more about leadership than 3 years of military training." Colonel Harrison shifted uncomfortably. "General, while I appreciate the loyalty of Captain Martinez's soldiers, the fact remains that she disobeyed orders." "Yes, she did," General Williams agreed. "And in doing so, she saved lives and completed a critical mission that conventional tactics would have failed to accomplish." She turned back to Sarah. "Captain, tell me about your decision-making process. When you chose to disobey orders, what was going through your mind?" Sarah took a deep breath, knowing that her answer would determine her future. "Ma'am, I was trained to accomplish the mission while taking care of my soldiers. In that situation, I believed that retreating would have meant abandoning soldiers who needed those supplies to survive. I also believed that my tactical plan had a high probability of success with minimal additional casualties, and the risk to your career. I considered it, ma'am. But the lives of the soldiers at that outpost were more important than my career prospects." General Williams closed the folder and stood up. "Captain Martinez, effective immediately. You are being relieved of your current command." Sarah's heart sank, but she maintained her composure. I understand, ma'am. You're being relieved because you're being promoted to major and transferred to our tactical planning division. Your unconventional thinking and willingness to take calculated risks are exactly what we need in our strategic planning. Sarah stared at the general in shock. Ma'am? Furthermore, the tactical innovations you employed during your mission are being studied and incorporated into our training programs. Your use of coordinated diversions and terrain exploitation showed creative problem-solving that our field commanders need to learn. Colonel Harrison looked equally surprised. General, I wasn't aware of these decisions. Colonel, Captain Martinez, Major Martinez, has shown us something important about command. Leadership isn't just about following orders blindly. It's about understanding the intent behind those orders and finding ways to accomplish the mission even when circumstances require unconventional approaches. The general moved to the window and looked out at the desert landscape. Too often our commanders become focused on avoiding risk rather than managing it effectively. Major Martinez understood that the greater risk was mission failure, not tactical innovation. She turned back to Sarah. However, this doesn't mean insubordination is now acceptable. Your decision worked because you had the tactical knowledge, leadership skills, and team trust necessary to execute a complex plan under pressure. Not every officer has those capabilities. Over the following weeks, Sarah's recovery became the focal point for a broader discussion about military leadership and tactical flexibility. Her story spread throughout the base, not as an example of successful insubordination, but as a case study in adaptive leadership under extreme circumstances. The training program that emerged from her experience emphasized several key principles: understanding mission intent beyond specific orders, building trust with subordinates, maintaining tactical awareness under stress, and having the courage to make difficult decisions when lives are at stake. Major Sarah Martinez found herself in the unusual position of being both a cautionary tale and an inspiration. During her first briefing to incoming officers, she was careful to emphasize the weight of her decision. I didn't disobey orders lightly, she told the assembled officers. I had to be absolutely certain that my plan would work and that the alternative, following orders to retreat, would result in greater harm. That's a burden that every commander must be prepared to carry. She paused, remembering the feeling of bleeding in the desert sand while trying to coordinate her soldiers. Leadership means being willing to sacrifice everything: your career, your reputation, even your life, for the mission and your soldiers. But it also means being smart enough to find ways to accomplish both. One young lieutenant raised her hand. Ma'am, how do you know when to take that risk? Sarah considered the question carefully. You know because you've built the trust and tactical knowledge necessary to make those decisions. You know because you understand that your soldiers are counting on you to find a way to succeed, not just a way to avoid blame. The training program that grew out of Sarah's experience became known informally as Command in Crisis and was eventually adopted throughout the military. It emphasized the importance of developing junior officers who could think independently while maintaining respect for chain of command and mission objectives. Years later, when Sarah had advanced to colonel and was commanding her own base, she would often tell the story of bleeding in the desert sand. Not as a tale of heroism, but as a reminder that true leadership sometimes requires choosing between easy compliance and difficult excellence. The lesson she taught wasn't that officers should disobey orders, but that they should develop the tactical knowledge, leadership skills, and moral courage necessary to find ways to accomplish their mission even when conventional approaches fail. Her legacy became the understanding that command isn't just about authority. It's about responsibility, innovation, and the willingness to bleed in the sand for your soldiers while never losing sight of the mission that brings meaning to their sacrifice. The base that once questioned her judgment came to understand that sometimes the most important lesson a leader can teach is that there are times when following orders blindly is a greater failure than having the courage to find a better way forward. Sarah Martinez had shown them the true meaning of command, not just the authority to give orders, but the wisdom to know when those orders must be transcended in service of a higher purpose.